Now, the Fourth Amendment says there's a couple parts. You have the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, and papers. And the second thing says it's against unreasonable search and seizures. And this is what I want to talk about. What's a legal search?
Yeah, the search warrant. Yeah, search warrant on probable cause.
Okay, and that's another thing. Let's write down probable cause. What's probable cause? If you're a cop and you see a guy weaving in the road, you pull him over, and you smell liquor on the guy's breath, you ask him to take a breathalyzer test. If he refuses, you have the right to search his car. Now, suppose there's a gun that's on the seat. Can the policeman have a legal search? Yes. But if the gun is under the seat and he's not looking for the gun and he accidentally finds the gun, there's a question. Is it a legal search or is it an illegal search? And now, with the different races and cultures, you have racial profiling that comes up with search and seizures. So when a search is started, the police try to make sure, I guess at the academy, that they do a proper search. Because if the guy is guilty and the search is illegal, they'll throw the case out of court. So the Supreme Court doesn't care if the person is innocent or guilty. They only care if they got their basic rights. So in Amendment 4, you also have a warrant. And a search warrant, can only be issued by a judge or a magistrate. Now sometimes, I'm looking for my eraser, oh here it is. Sometimes this is not so. When I was in my 30s, I guess, I went to visit a friend who lived up in New York State, far up by Buffalo. And it was like an 8-hour drive. And I was driving on what they call Route 17, which was a major thoroughfare. I was speeding. So I get stopped, and it was one of these hick towns. So they took me right from the car to the courthouse. And the courthouse was a little building, and I walked up a flight of stairs, and I see a guy sitting there with a big potbelly, suspenders, and I said, "Where's the judge?" He goes, "You're looking at him." So he was the postmaster, he was the magistrate, and he basically ran the city. So I tried to plead my case to him that I wasn't speeding or whatever I said, but I was guilty. So he fined me like $150. And that's how they made their money. They would catch you in speed traps or doing something on the highway. So they had occasionally judge, jury, and executioner until they got caught. But for the most part, searches and seizures are very carefully watched. And you have to talk about a search and a seizure, why that amendment came about. In the 1760s and the 1770s, the British had something called the writ of assistance, where they would go into a house, say 10, 12 soldiers, and demand that the colonials put them up, feed them. Sometimes they trashed the house, but the people had no rights. So when the Constitutional Convention came, and even though the Southerners and Northerners hated each other, they demanded a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, to give them their basic freedoms so nobody could take their rights away. So people were very, very aware of what their rights were and what their rights weren't. Now, What about wiretapping? Is that federal? Is it FBI? Suppose they want to catch a gangster like John Gotti, and he had a social club that he would hang out in, and he was stupid, he was arrogant, so he would talk about his crimes in the social club, and they would wiretap him, and he went to court and he beat it. So he realized he couldn't talk he figured his phones were bugged, his house was bugged, so he'd always go outside and talk to his associates and cover his mouth because the people watching him were lip readers. And they knew that they couldn't catch him. But eventually Gotti slipped up because he was a murderer and he was arrogant. And even the mob families wanted to get rid of him because he was crazy. I mean, there were some mob bosses, like a guy by the name of Tony Accaro. I think he was from Philadelphia. He was under the radar. He lived in a small house. He didn't show his wealth, but he was a killer. I mean, make no mistake about it. But he died at 87 years old. He never spent a day in jail because he didn't flaunt his wealth and he didn't boast. Like John Gotti, when he got off, they called him the Teflon Don. And he got off, and Bruce Cutler was his lawyer. So the court made sure that on the fourth trial, they disqualified Cutler from representing him. And the way they did it was through a wiretap. They found him talking to John Gotti, and he compromised himself by talking about illegal activities. Like John Gotti was boasting about what he did. Now, in the New York families, drugs were off limits. Prostitution was fine, gambling was fine, loan sharking was fine, you can break somebody's legs, but drugs is a dirty business. And if you watch The Godfather, and a guy wanted to meet with him, he said, I need $1 million in cash and all your political connections. And he said, your end of the deal will be $4 million, and you have to do nothing but just give me the $1 million in cash. So he said, what's in it for the other families? He was smart. So the guy said, I'll take care of it out of my pocket. But he said, I have to give you my answer, and my answer is no, because drugs is a dirty business, and all my politicians will run the other way. So tell me, what is invasion of privacy? That's another part of the Fourth Amendment. In your own words, tell me, what's an invasion of privacy? Give me an example.
Oh, somebody who wrote letters, or somebody got hold and published them, or
right.
Would be one example. Or
what about the press? What do they have? How are they protected, as opposed to a regular citizen?
well, First Amendment, but there are limits on that too.
Now, if a reporter won't give up a source, I always see the judge would hold him in contempt, and they put him in jail until he gave up the source. And if you give up your source will never trust you again. So you have a lot of confidential informants who are, criminals, but they want to save their own skin, and they'll make a deal with the authorities, so they'll get a lesser sentence, or they'll get probation, and they'll go in the witness protection plan. And why are cases overturned based on technicalities?
Usually because some procedure wasn't followed properly.
Exactly. If procedure isn't followed correctly, especially under the Fourth Amendment, the search and seizure, and it goes to the Supreme Court, the Fourth Amendment, and I'm going to get a Fourth Amendment case here, the judge will, if it goes to the Supreme Court will overturn the decision, even if the guy is guilty as could be, he goes free. And it's because of the amendments. The Supreme Court doesn't care if you're innocent or guilty. What do they care about? What's the big thing they care about? The Constitution. And I have a case here, and I looked it up, and that's the only time I use the internet. It's Kilo versus the United States, 2001. So I'm talking about a pretty recent case. In 1992, federal agents William Elliott and Dan Haas used a thermal imaging device to scan a triplex in which Danny Kilo lived. The agents suspected that Kilo was growing marijuana plants inside the home. Growing marijuana indoors typically requires the use of grow lamps that put off a large amount of heat. The thermal imaging test was conducted from the passenger seat of Agent Elliott's car. The test showed that an area over a garage, a side wall, was substantially warmer than the rest of the house and substantially warmer than other houses in the neighborhood. Based on these results of the test, the electricity bills that were higher than the room for his area and informant tips, a federal magistrate issued a warning authorizing a search of Kilo's residence. The search revealed over 100 marijuana plants growing inside the home. Kilo was indicted in one count of manufacturing marijuana. Kilo was unsuccessful in an attempt to suppress the evidence seized from his home. This went to a lower court now. He later entered a conditional guilty plea, retaining the right to appeal. On appeal, the Ninth Circuit Court remanded the case to the district court. Let's see, let me get my paper straight here. To determine the intrusiveness of the thermal imaging test. The district court found the imaging test to be non-intrusive, noting that the device used cannot penetrate walls or windows to reveal conversations or human activities. The district court upheld the warrant as valid and affirmed the denial to suppress the evidence sealed. On appeal, the Ninth Circuit Court initially reversed the conviction, but after withdrawal of the opinion and a change in membership of the court, affirmed the district court's decision. They held that Kilo had no exception of privacy because he had made no attempt to conceal the heat detected by the thermal imaging device, and if he had, there still was no reasonable expectation of privacy because the test did not reveal any intimate details of Kilo's life. How do you think the Supreme Court voted? Look at the case. They go to this guy's house. They suspect that he has marijuana based on good evidence, but it's circumstantial because they don't know what's in the house, but putting two and two together, they figured out that he was growing marijuana. Judge Scalia, who's the most conservative justice in the court, delivered the opinion of the Supreme Court. He reversed the ruling of the Court of Appeals, holding that the imaging test revealed details of a private home that could not have been previously known without physically entering the house. Therefore, the test that constituted a search under the Fourth Amendment and was presumably unreasonable without a warrant. So here you have the most conservative judge overturning the lower court's decision. And this is very rare because I would have always guessed that Scalia would vote in favor of the police. But he interpreted the Constitution just that way. And we have issues here: right to privacy, illegal and legal searches, and everybody can decide what's an illegal search and what's an illegal search. So if you're driving in a car and you're pulled over, say for a broken taillight, what rights do the police have? They can stop you and do what? Ticket you. Now, where do they go over the line?
Start looking in the back seat.
If they start looking in the back seat and they happen to find 2 ounces of cocaine, it's an illegal search because they weren't specifically looking for the cocaine. And say the cocaine was hidden and they picked up the flap and they found the cocaine. They weren't looking for cocaine, they found it, so it was illegal. But if the cocaine was on the seat in plain view, the police would have a reasonable search. So the Fourth Amendment basically was search and seizure. And wiretapping came about in the 1930s after the Lindbergh trial. And Charles Lindbergh, as you all know, was a pilot that in 1920s, what was it, 1923? 27? Went from New York, I forgot the what was the base?
On Long Island.
It was on Long Island. I'll think of it. And he flew solo to Paris without stopping. When he went to Paris, he was a hero. And he was a hero because now a new thing came into existence where people can get places very quickly. It used to take months to go on a boat to go to Europe. Or it would take, weeks, months, whatever. But now it's a possibility that you can go to, once the planes were built, you can go to Europe, where you can go across country in a matter of hours. Now, the jet engine was invented in like 45, and they started using jets commercially in the 50s. And I remember as a kid, my parents taking me to Florida in the 60s, and it took close to 3 hours to get from New York to Miami. And that was really incredible, thinking that in 1927, a guy was able to go to Paris. But there was one big problem with Lindbergh. He didn't want to be a hero. He was a loner. And he also was very sympathetic to the Nazi movement. Now, he belonged to a committee called the America First Committee. And Hitler invited him over to see the Luftwaffe. And he wanted to brag because Lindbergh knew a lot about airplanes. And when Lindbergh saw it, he was so impressed. And of course, FDR immediately called Lindbergh to the White House and asked him what happened. And he said there's no way the United States could beat Germany with their Air Force. So Roosevelt got scared, and that's when he started to mobilize. I mean, in earnest. Not only airplanes, but factories started going, guns, and the Congress wouldn't let him give, they wanted to stay out of war, and they wouldn't let him give aid to Britain. Britain was begging for aid because when Hitler attacked, they were getting beaten. So Roosevelt came up with something called the Lend-Lease policy, where he would lend weapons to Britain, and he would get in turn Caribbean rights to trade. So it was really an end run around the Constitution. Now, why are cases thrown out on a technicality? Again, because of rights. And the court cases in 2000 were different than the court cases in, say, 1930 or 1937. So that was just one case that I was reading from the Fourth Amendment.